Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Peter. Peter, for everyone out there listening who might not know who you are, you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, so I'm Peter Tymms, and I'm emeritus professor from the UK, from Durham University. I was a teacher for many years in my 20s and 30s, and then switched to university, where I've been doing research on a range of things. And we'll see how the conversation goes. But I know that you've mentioned ADHD. That's an interest of mine, but also on the impact of government policies on children's attainment and the narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor, and what researchers are doing or not doing, and understanding the system. So there's plenty to talk about.
Where would you start with, like when it comes to what you've discovered or what you've learned about maybe government policies or anything of that sort?
Okay, so let's take government policies. So around the world, we see great interest from government to increase the attainment of the children in schools, and also to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor. That's been going on seriously for 20 or 30 years. Some governments that were very satisfied with what they saw in their schools were shocked when the international comparison data started to come out. There's projects called PISA, Tymms, Pearls, which collect data, comparative data on maths, reading, science in countries, 60, 70 countries around the world. And a country like Germany and Russia looked at those results and they thought they were doing really well. And when they saw those results, it was a shock. And so they tried to transform. Or in the UK, we go back to Tony Blair when he was prime minister, and he got elected partly on the phrase education, education, education. He was going to make a difference. And of course, in the United States, there's been major moves to improve educational systems, a lot of money put in, a lot of people's ideas. So there's been massive efforts around the world to make a difference.
Do you think that the education system, which in my opinion, I think it's definitely improved, and that's coming from someone where I feel like the education system really did not give me a chance. It was kind of like I didn't fit the average norm of just, and I don't blame teachers. I used to think it was the teacher's fault, that I wasn't getting enough time. Because I think if you ask anybody the simple question, have you ever had a teacher that really cared about you? Or do you have a favorite teacher? They could pick 1, 2, 3 teachers that really took, I guess, investment into their personality or who they are and really kind of help them along the way. And I have 3 teachers that I could name that have done that for me. But a lot of it is they have a large workload when it comes to the amount of classes and students they have to teach. I mean, I always thought it would be better if we went back to like how they do it in some places where you have one teacher that is with you your whole entire years all the way through school. So you don't have to worry about them. Like, because I mean, think about it. Each conversation I have, for instance, I have 1,000 something episodes. That means I have to learn and talk to and get to know a whole new person each time. That is exactly what a teacher does with students. Each year, they teach all this kid knowing that they're going to end eventually, after the year's up, move on to another class. Then they have to invest and restart from the beginning with a whole new batch of students. That seems monotonous. Eventually, you just start getting on a routine where you're just like, here, we're going to watch Forrest Gump in class. Like that, I feel like you need to focus a little bit more when it comes to the education system, which it has take giant strides, especially when it comes to like certain disorders, for instance, like ADHD being a disorder, or which me, it's a benefit, but it also, like we were talking off air, the curiosity aspect gets me in a little bit of trouble when it comes to the topics I'm interested in. But I feel like if you are able to sit down and have the time, the teachers would have the time, they would eventually, you would see a lot more of a turnaround when it comes to people soaking up more information, connecting, and being able to really get down. Like if some student's having trouble, you walk them through the problem. Now, if you have 30 kids in a class, you can't walk each individual kid having a problem. You might have to stay after class or something like that. But what kid's going to stay after class? They want to move on to the next thing. But the education system, I mean, would it be more money that we funnel into it? Would it be more individual time, like I was talking about a minute ago, or what would it be?
Well, there is a lot of more money gone into education around the world, certainly in the United States and elsewhere. And picking up your points about your own experience there, I do think that schools have become nicer places over the years. So the attention to a particular child with a particular issue, there's more understanding of that particular issue, more empathy, more sympathy, and so on. And if I don't know, in some parts of the United States, the teachers would have hit children. They would have beaten them with a paddle or something. And certainly I was caned when I was school. But that was outlawed in country after country after country. And that was kind of representative of the places becoming nicer places and becoming less authoritarian, that the teacher knows and needs to understand the child. So there's been a lot of that and a lot of better understanding by the researchers of ADHD. I mean, we have a paper out which shows that if you compare children of similar attentiveness, those that are impulsive tend to do better because they kind of engage with what's going on more than the other kids. They get physically excited by new ideas. They can blurt out answers, shout out, put their hands up. It can annoy some teachers, that's for sure. But actually the kids can kind of benefit and they're understood better. And of course, now we've got the big randomized controlled trial results coming out from medication versus other ways. And we know that the medication kind of calms kids down, but in the long run, they don't do that much better. And actually, the first protocol shouldn't be medication. And the medical provision for boys in the United States is quite astounding. And in fact, I would say shocking on occasions. So you've got this kind of thing where the schools are nicer places, I think they were.
Do you think it's just people's understanding of more alternative methods of being able to handle a kid that might have a certain thing that's not what I would say normal? Like, I don't know what normal is. That word normal to me just sounds stupid only because everyone's uniquely different in so many different aspects. Now, there's a broad template you could do for people, but for the longest time, it was give them a pill. And when I actually had my third grade teacher on here, who was one of the teachers I was talking about that did invest into me, she was on my show and she told me, you had ADHD. Any kid with energy doesn't want to sit down and listen. So what I did was I let you run out and get all your energy out. Like, make sure you ran and got your energy out. And then you sat down, you were more attentive in class. And it's like, you're seeing stuff like yoga be implemented in some schools. Now, I'm not a yoga person, but if a kid's having strong anger issues and needs to balance himself out, instead of having them sit and scribble and draw, like that's a good form of therapy, maybe, let them have a session where they take a breath or they talk about some of their issues a little bit more. I think medication's a weird one because I think it's needed at times, but I also think it shouldn't be the cure-all answer for everything. And I think that still boils down to the problem of the time consumption. They're at there for 8 hours, 7 hours, and not including lunch. And it's like, it's very, very hard to make sure that they're soaking up all the information. But if you had more individual time with your students, like a lower class load, but I can't increase the number of teachers.
Yeah. I mean, the work on class size is very interesting because, of course, as you just said, it gets very expensive. If you want to half the class size, you've got to double the number of teachers. And that means that most of the education spend is on teachers' salary. So you more or less double the money. And what's more, you start to maybe go for the teachers who just missed out on being teachers. So you're taking in the less good teachers by expanding the number of teachers. So there's a balance to be had. And in the big experiments that we saw in the United States on that, where they deliberately halved the class size, there was a slight increase, particularly for those whose first language wasn't English, and the immigrants did slightly better. But it wasn't a massive transformation. The kids were more or less doing as they were in the past.
Well, what like specific areas do you see that they're starting to implement more? Because like I've talked to someone who's talked about like the US used to just pull their scientists and all these researchers from other countries and they would use them for their own, kind of like get the best of the batch. Then eventually they started going, wait, maybe we need our own scientists. Like we need to start, because nobody's going to lend us their scientists anymore. So I could see where that could help funnel the education. But also I think when I talk to so many people from like Switzerland or another country, they're very fluent in English. Or when I talk to someone in Russia or Ukraine, whatever you want to say, they're very fluent in a second language. And I go, that's not your language. That's very interesting. That, oh, we're taught this in the education system. We're taught this at the beginning. Now we have Spanish classes, but if you're like me, I got out of Spanish by taking HVAC, a trade class. But it seems like the world needs to adopt the English language rather than learning another one. Like I feel like for us, we should have more of a broad range when it comes to we have a immigration thing that happens. There's going to be people that aren't going to want to learn English or aren't going to be able to speak English that well. You might as well make it easier for them by teaching, another language, make it, I guess, mandatory, I would say, for a lot of kids, Spanish, French, a universal one that more people know?
Yeah. Yes, the English language is a really interesting one because, of course, in the United States, you've got immigrants from all countries around the world, and you can find classes, kindergarten classes, where there are every language on earth being spoken in those different kindergartens. But of course, they lose it as they take on American and become all American kids as they move up. And you might regard that as a good thing because it homogenizes and make people the good, but you lose your heritage. And the studies now tell us that actually taking on another language when you're young is better for brain function. So the people who are speaking more than one language, maybe at home, the father speaks one language, the mother speaks another language, or maybe they're living in Canada and they're picking up French and English, or maybe they're on the border or in California and they're picking up Spanish and English. They benefit from that cognitively. They think better as a result. So when you see those Swedes, just an ordinary person in the street speaking Swedish at home, but English to the visitors, well, they're benefiting from that dual nationality or that dual language processing. And we didn't think that in the past, but we do think that now. And that's the result of the research that's gone on over time. So we're more appreciative and more understanding of different cultures. But of course, America has traditionally taken in brains around the world, and they've got the money to do that. And people come to the universities or whatever, or the doctors, and they're educated in different countries and they're taken to that country. If I take India, where many doctors have produced great doctors, many of those will then leave India and come and become doctors in the United States. And that benefits the United States, probably does some harm to India because it loses the brighter and the best that they've got there. And so around the world, I think this is going to continue. And it's a great shame that America is not producing more of these highly skilled people than it does.
Doesn't that open up the door for, I would say, like, but imagine if we create our own scientists or our own researchers more, so we wouldn't have to reach out to India or another country to be able to do so. What about that person's goal of making it to America and becoming a doctor or something like that? Like, it's a double-edged sword. Whatever you do, it's like you got to look at the least worst option, but that really sucks that it has to be that avenue of like the least worst option. I mean, as much as you can say like there needs to be improvements, as much as I can say there needs to be improvements on things, we're doing pretty well with just the massive amount that we're trying to funnel and the amount that we're trying to produce as well too. Now there can be improvements, but what do you think about like a lot of stuff that goes on now, like with critical race theory teachings and all that as well too? My only issue with that is I don't think it's being handled properly. I think it's being very jammed in or rushed in because of amount of empathy that people feel. Now, this is like a very controversial topic, obviously, but I mean, I took African American studies when I went to college. Well, as a sitting class, I took one because that was the only one option. I wasn't going to wait a whole nother year to graduate. I wanted to take that class and get it done so I could just move on to the next one. There was like, I was the only white person in there, which doesn't matter. But when they're reading the syllabus and it's like 40 years a slave and all these types of things that are very, very like heavy topics, you feel eyes piercing into the back of your head. And it's just like, I'm gonna like, how do I take this tension out of the air? And then I went up and when we were all introducing ourselves, I was like, I'm Robbie, I'm a Capricorn, I like long walks on something stupid like that. And everyone laughed. And then afterwards, they were like, come up to me and high-fived me and were like, yeah, man, we were getting a little bit like we were staring at you. We're going to jump you after class. And I was like, what? Like, you don't realize, like, you got to make sure when you're teaching a topic like this, you need to make sure that you understand, like, there needs to be perspectives on both sides. You can't just teach one part of history. It's like a lot of people, like, recently, well, not recently, probably like 6, 7 months ago, were upset about like the real American history. Like George Washington's teeth weren't made of cherry wood, they were made of slaves' teeth. And it's like, yeah, it's better for the books. It sucks that they lied like that, but you had so many people like, what? And then they wanted to tear down statues, and a whole bunch of other issues started popping up. And it's like, you gotta, when you talk about this stuff, you gotta come clean with everything. You gotta tell them the truth. You can't just blend it with the history books, but it needs to be done effectively, where you don't have a bunch of people upset feeling like the world is shunning or world is spinned in this certain direction, when you just got a lot of information in a short amount of time that you need to unpack in a good amount of time to do so.
Yeah, gosh, there's some issues there. I've been absolutely astounded by what happened in Florida with the banning of certain textbooks because of critical race theory or some other perceptions. And I've had a look at those books, and I found them quite innocuous. I didn't feel that there was any problem with them at all, and and people seem to get on their high horse about, this shouldn't be there and so on. It was really attempts by educators to make the curriculum more accessible to wider groups. And there has, in many places, been an attempt to decolonize the curriculum, so that if we look at the histories and what people talk about, they talk about one small group of people as being part of that history. But actually, there are many, many people. For example, in mathematics, who's contributed to maths that we learn at school? Well, of course, it was the Greeks, and of course, it was the Europeans. But don't forget that actually the letters that we use come from India, from North India, or the infinity from there, or Pythagoras probably originated in China. And so the story that we get at school is blinkered. And history in particular is a touchstone for what happens. So if you look at the history curriculum around the world, it becomes very sensitive, so that we're hearing that in the United States, and people worried about the way in which the history is taught, or what is the real history. But we look in other parts of the world, you'd find the same. So that in Japan, compared to China, you would see the Chinese, who were occupied in some parts by the Japanese during the Second World War, really objecting to what's being taught in Japanese history, which they see as a kind of washing over the real oppression that the Japanese caused during the Second World War. But you find that played out around the world all the time. In my own country, you would see a kind of history which is taught, which really is almost colonial in its way of thinking. I was certainly taught about great victories of the British in the past, and nowadays I would think, gosh, that was just ethnic cleansing when we're thinking about it. So you get that kind of stuff going. You see it at the moment, but with Putin rewriting the history from Ukraine. So you see it absolutely everywhere. It's really sensitive.
That's what's important. Like when people say that you got to take critical race theory out of schools, or you got to teach it, it's like you got to have both. You can't take it out 100%. You can't do that, but it needs to be taught effectively. Like I've had plenty of teachers that are teaching US history, and they'd be like, guys, this was a horrible thing that happened, but it's so good that we think now that it's so horrible because it shows how much we've grown. And it's like this completely like, yeah, you should know about this stuff. You can't hide your history. It's important to not make the same mistakes, obviously. But when you're just showing all the bad and the bell goes off and then everyone walks out into the world thinking that, oh my God, it's like, hold on a second, you need to de-cleanse there, you need to release all that, what you need to talk about it. And I think that's what it should be done effectively. But there's a large push I'm starting to realize. Like, I remember all the time when I was a kid, it was like you pledge allegiance to the flag, at least that's what we did in the States, and you would say God in the actual Pledge of Allegiance, and it's like you saw that just go away. They stopped doing it. And I was always wondering what that was. Like, we don't really pledge allegiance. Like, you don't have to stand there. Like, every kid had to stand there and put their hand on their heart. Now they just play it on the monitor and nobody really pays attention to it. Where it's like, is that because people are losing faith in the government, or they're losing faith in their country? Or is an idea that Christianity isn't the exact religion anymore? It seems like there's a large amount of people that either choose to worship at home, or there's other religious influences out there now, which you point it back to like schools. And this is going to be like a weird kind of tangent, but schools, like there are some teachers that go, yeah, you can celebrate, but it's like, but if you're gonna let someone speak their religious, side or whatever they choose to be religious in, how do you choose which one? Like you can't just teach Christianity anymore because there's so many others out there.
Yeah. And of course, in the United States, you're not meant to have religion in the schools, unlike some other countries where they're
Separation,
specifically.
yeah. Church and state.
Yeah, I know there's some people are trying to push back on that, but you've got that separation, and yeah, maybe that's the origin of it. But it's very interesting. So they don't salute to the flag anymore; they just hear it played. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, at least when I got into high school, it eventually was just played on a TV where a lot of kids just sat in their seats. They didn't even really listen to it. It seemed like it was not really like before. I remember when I was a kid, it was there was be a moment of silence, there'd be all of that, but you would stand up. Every kid in class would be doing that, and then I go into like see my nephew or whoever, my little cousins in school, and they're not doing that in the mornings anymore. And it's kind of like, okay, so we thought differently about it. I don't know if that's just a time thing or just attention spans are so shot right now.
Well, maybe it's just a general movement that we're less respectful of authority and people on top and less nationalistic. Perhaps I don't know. We're certainly not very nationalistic in the UK. Well, in England we're not. So because we're ashamed somewhat, I think, of our flag and what we did in the past. So we kind of move
You
on.
can't be ashamed of that. Like I know you should recognize errors, but you also shouldn't be trying like it's really weird in the education systems today. It's like so hard because whenever you talk about something like this, they say they're like woke ideology and all that. And it's like I don't believe in, I guess, making another race lower than another one. Like, I don't see people like that. You know what I mean? Like, it's even saying that people go, oh, sure, you don't see race. It's like, no, generally, if it's a person, I want to have a conversation with them. But, like, you know who Brett Weinstein is?
No.
He was sparking up this like movement on a campus to go like kind of teach this certain topic that was like highly controversial. It was like a critical race theory kind of topic. Well, eventually all these people supported him and then they turned on him and they started looking for him on the college campus with baseball bats. Like it got to that point where now there was this idea of now no white people can come onto the campus for that specific day to honor the people that went through slavery all those years ago. And it was like, does that make any sense? Like, if anything, you would let the people have a day off yeah, we get it. You experience some pain, you experience things that maybe white people don't deal with. Let them stay home, let them get paid to stay home for that day. Let them have a thing to recognize that. But they were like, no, no white people can come on campus. And it was like, I like this is right now, even talk about this. That's why I say my ADHD gets me in trouble because it's a controversial subject and people don't like it when the narrative is, no, you need to apologize, you need to do this. And I'm like, man, all you're doing is making another race feel inferior about themselves. And they go, well, that's white privilege. And it's like, well, do you know how weird that sounds? The word white privilege, like it brings us down this weird thing where you go, like, what happens if you changed white privilege to something else? Like it would be racist.
Yes, and well, yeah, I've spent a lot of time in different parts of the world. I taught in Africa for some time. I was born in South Africa. My wife's from India. I've done work in China and so on. So I've kind of seen all these from different perspectives. And you're right. We need to respect everybody in their own circumstance and acknowledge also for badness that happened in the past. If I just take the case in India at the moment, there has traditionally there been a caste system, so that you have people at the top, the Brahmins, and they come down through stage right down to the untouchables at the bottom, and that's of course banned by law. It's kind of outmoded and so on. And there's an interesting book from the United States called Caste, which draws parallel between the different races, mimicking what was happening in India over that. And you would think that maybe India's moved beyond that after its independence, after the Second World War, and it's forged this very strong economy and a very strong identity, and doing very well in many ways. But its present president, Modi, is pretty well on that side of the caste system. He would never say it openly, but it's Hindus at the top and the Muslims are definitely worse than that, and the Christians, well, we'll tolerate them for a moment, but we don't want too many of them. We don't want them converting any Hindus to Christianity for sure. And that caste system is lurking in the background of the politics in that country. So, I've kind of been part of that. I've just come back from a month in India, and you kind of see it from a distance, or maybe read a little bit in the press. My wife's family is actually from a Christian background in India, which has been there for a very long time, and so you kind of out of the system somewhat. But for many people, that's dominated their lives. They were born into a caste, and they're expected to live their lives in that caste. But you have freedom fighters who want to fight against that and bring that to the fore and say, no, we need to get rid of that. So there are untouchables now who are pretty prominent people and fighting for it, but they have to fight for it,
Where do you see like the problem, for instance? I mean, I can't examine what happens in India because I don't know a lot about what happens over there. But if I like look at issues that are happening in the States, for instance, you have kids walking out of class, you have kids protesting and doing all these things. And I'm glad I don't really care. People can express themselves however they feel, but I also think it shouldn't impede on another person's education as well, too. And I don't know where it really stems from, because I heard someone mention something where they go, if your kid is going to a class, shouldn't you have that class like a number you can call to listen in on what the teachers are teaching your kids?
Oh, wow.
And it's like, that is a good idea though. Like if a parent is concerned about what their kids are learning in school, not even the critical race topic, but other things like there's a large amount of, I wouldn't like, when we talk about the woke thing, there's teachers out there that are teaching kids that like the government or certain political parties or all this type of stuff, and they're letting the politics get leaked into the education system. Like I feel like a parent who's concerned, like their kid comes home and they're talking about like NATO or something like that. The guy's like, why is my son talking about NATO? And then you just start realizing that the teacher's teaching them about all these things that are going on from their political side. They could be Republican, they could be Democrat, they could be whatever. And I just feel like when you have a educational system like that, or any educational system, I've talked to so many academics where they go, well, my school supplies my research funding and the school gets their research funding from the government. I'm like, that right there doesn't sound right. That should be completely taken away, because that's influencing decision. You're going to only get money and you're going to sway it a certain way. It's business influence into research studies, basically. And I go, that's a problem.
Yes, I see that. Of course, there are many grant-giving organizations that aren't part of the government that people can go to. So there are independent bodies that have been foundations that are set up, and you can get money from them. But if you're going to be a researcher, you have to get your money from somewhere.
Yeah.
And certainly I've taken money which is ultimately organized by the government, although they would say they just set up the funds and then you bid for it, and then the other academics decide who's going to get that money. And I just thought I would share with you, I'd kind of written down here how much money and how many researchers there are, so we get a kind of feel for that, because we mentioned research. So I reckon there are hundreds of thousands of educational researchers around the world studying education. There's journals. The people write their papers and they get published in journals, in education journals. There are 162 educational journals, of which I publish in a few of those, but they're around the world. And if we look up how many education articles are published every year, and I looked on Google Scholar, and those that just have education in the title, more than 100,000 in 1 year. So we might worry about what one way research is doing or what they're doing, but my God, there's a lot of it.
Dude, there's so many interesting stuff out there. Like I'm telling you, when I like my brain going off on random different subjects and stuff. Like when I look up something about like what is vitamin B12, vitamin D, all these vitamins that we have, and then I'm looking through articles of people that are researching these small things, and then I reach out to them. They're like, that was a PhD paper I did a couple of years ago. It was nothing really. And I'm like, yeah, but it's interesting. That's the thing, is that you go onto Google Scholar, you go into ResearchGate, you go onto any of these institutions or any of these medical journals, for instance. I type in adrenal glands. Is there adrenal fatigue? Is there any experiences of adrenal fatigue? You start realizing, no, your body has enough adrenaline to last you 2 lifetimes. times, no matter how many fights or situations that you get in, you're never going to experience adrenal fatigue. And you're like, okay. But then you find the one study that's like, oh, you can experience adrenal fatigue. And I'm like, I have to talk to these people to understand their science and their mechanisms. But if I honestly controlled the money, I would be like, which I mean, people say like, oh, it's our tax dollars going to this. I mean, that's a really good point. I just don't think the government should have their name attached to it. I think there's a lot of interesting people out there, but they're probably not getting funding no matter how many requests they submit, because it's not of the interest of whoever's going to loan out that money. And I go, well, if it's the people's money, we already know it's going somewhere. So instead of the government having their name on it, just say it's coming out of the people's money. And the next thing you know, fund whatever. I would like to fund a vitamin D study. I would like to fund a study about cats and dogs. What's the difference in their hearing? I don't know. It's just random, but it's interesting. We need science to excel forward, and that's by looking everywhere and accepting everything.
Okay, but more people want to do research, some of which costs a lot of money. Some studies will cost millions of pounds to find out a little small thing.
That's true.
So we have to have a mechanism to decide who's going to get that money. At the moment, the researchers will write a proposal and it will be read by other researchers elsewhere who will rate its quality, and then the money will be allocated or not. So although there's a lot of money and although there's a lot of research, it isn't infinite. So somebody's got to make some decisions somewhere by some mechanism. And I can't think of a better way than asking other researchers. Or in medicine, there's an interesting move now from the Lind Foundation, which says that, okay, the medics decide what to research. Maybe we should ask the patients what we should be researching, because it's those who will get the treatment in the long run. So there's another kind of body. And certainly when I've been on ADH panels, there's always been the academic researchers, but there's also been someone who's got ADHD there to sit up and speak up for that group there. And they've been very useful in the bodies. So maybe we need to evolve what we're doing.
Well, we have groups like STEM and all that, but it's like, what about groups that are just like people like myself that have ADHD or have some ability to not want to get sleep and, have a lot of free time, for instance, to be able to search over so many scholarly articles and be able to research and, really knock down that it's like the DMV, man. Like whenever you go to the DMV to go get your license or something like that, or get some type of new tag on your car, it's like an hour and a half wait because they have only two lines open and like 100 something people in there, and each person is spending like 45 minutes to an hour talking to the one person that doesn't really care about helping this one person. And it's like, that's what I picture like reviewing of journals. If you're not reaching out to your friends to review your journal who can do it real quick, you're reaching out to an unknown name. And most researchers, I would say, probably spend a lot of time in isolation doing research projects and things of that sort, so you don't have a lot of time to communicate and talk to people. Your project ends up waiting a couple of years where you eventually just do the research and wait for the money to come later. And I go, what happens if we just had like a couple small committees per institution, people that are generally have that could be a whole research study, analyzing and looking through peer reviewed journals. But my only issue is, again, it boils back to the politics thing. You can't have any political base. Like for me, I don't care about politics whatsoever. I care about issues for sure. But when it comes to like being politically homeless, like I don't have a bias in one certain thing. I honestly, if there's evidence there, if there's research there, if there's this there, then you should get money for what you're trying to do. And then it's like, yeah, it's a lot easier said than done. I'm trying to keep that in my head as well too. Yeah, but if you had a group of people that weren't invested or had a bias in a certain thing, like a Democrat, Republican, whatever you want to say, or didn't have like, oh, this person's researching plants, chemicals. I'd rather research the weapons. No, like just is there like good study there? Did they write it out really, really well and it looks really, really good and they're actually really interested in doing this? Look at their profile, look at their research paper, and then make your decision. It should be pretty simple. You can tell when someone's just doing something to get another name on a piece of paper.
Right, right. I mean, there's another issue here. Apart from doing the research, it's then publishing the research. And there is a corrupt system operating at the moment, so that many of the journals are owned by big publishing companies, and they want to make money from these bits of research. So that gets published in that. And an ordinary person cannot access that journal without paying quite a lot of money to read it. So there's a movement now for open access so that when people publish, they will publish it so it's open. And from my perspective, that is the way that we should be going. We shouldn't ever be doing research which doesn't produce results that everybody can see, not just a few people in Harvard or Cambridge, but people everywhere should be able to see it. Otherwise, you get a bias built into that system. And because of the historical way this has evolved, it means that some journals are regarded as the top journal, and you've got to get your name in that journal if you're going to be a great researcher. But that journal is owned by a publishing house that won't release that data unless you pay a lot of money for it. So there's a problem with the way that we feedback results, and maybe, as you say, a problem with we decide who does what research on what way.
Well, even with open science, I think their issue with holding data or not releasing certain studies is because they're afraid that the general public wouldn't be able to interpret the data correctly. And I mean, I feel like you still need to have it up there anyway. Like the best part about like open science, there's a lot of accounts and pages and ResearchGate. Even though it says you need an account, you can still scroll through articles if you want. You can't message the authors. You need to have an institution profile. I mean, yeah, you got to stop trolls from coming in as well too. Those little people like trolling on the internet. But I feel like if you open up the door to people being able to look at a lot of studies and make their decisions for themselves, any person that really wants to get down to the answer of stuff, they're going to look through every side of it. Then you're going to have people that are going to run off with the first thing. I mean, this is a start. It's not the perfected method, and I don't think we've perfected anything in out throughout history. But people rather bring up the problems on things, like when I said about interpreting the data wrong, and be like, "Well, we're not ready to release it until we can figure out this problem." It's like that's a problem that might never get fixed, and the actual answer might be that it works itself out. If people have like what I say for my show, for instance, I can talk to a researcher if I reach out to him. That's the best thing for me to be able to funnel out my own thoughts and my own ideas and my own thing by talking to someone who's knowledgeable in that field. Like, I feel like a lot of people, if they had that access, which is starting to increase with social media a little bit, which is a beneficial thing about it, the interactions you can have with researchers and stuff. Not only can you get your paper seen more, but you can have people be interested in the subject that you're interested in. Like if I did not come across your academic profile and reach out to you specifically about whatever topic, but then now we're in this field where we're just talking about the education system in general, that's a conversation that is so much worth and value that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to if it wasn't for social media, if it wasn't for these types of things. It can be used in a positive light, but it's about making that the objective as well too. And the objective is not that. The objective is to find what's trending, and what's always trending is something political or something huge. And that's where I say, like, you got to separate these things. Like right now in this time in history, maybe it's just my circle or maybe the people that I've been talking to, but politics seems to be involved in everything. And I don't like that at all. But because it leaks into academia, because when it comes into academia, people are going to start researching things and then they're going to feel like they have to reach out to a billionaire to get their funding for their project. You see this with Bezos, you see this with Musk. He's hiring researchers about space travel. Now, here's a little example. This might take us on a weird route. But if I'm a researcher and I'm trying to research something, let's say beneficial to humankind, like a renewable energy source, and then I go and try and pitch this to get funding and it's to the government goes, can you try going this way? And you're like, well, my study's this way though. Well, I get it. You want to do that one, but we want to try and go to more electric route. So if you can skew it to just the electricity, we'll use some of your stuff and we'll fund you. And then you can go in this direction. Okay. Now your original mission has now been skewed. So instead of looking for a renewable and solar, you're now just focusing on trying to find electric energy or trying to find it going that way. And then eventually, how long are you going to sit there and study that one thing and go back to your original mission? 75% chance you're probably not going to circle back to your original mission. You know what I mean? Like that's what happens with people that reach out to billionaires. Okay, I'm going to build a rocket that's all on sustainable energy. That's cool, but can you make a rocket that would actually make it to Mars? It might not need sustainable energy, but I just want a rocket that goes to Mars. And you're like, well, my whole thing is making a rocket that can just work on renewable energy. And it's like, I get it, but let's go to Mars. And then you lose the mission.
Yeah, but if we look at the history of individuals, if we look at people as they start out being researchers or whatever, you'll find that they would have wanted to go down one route, but then they get adjusted because they didn't get the grant, because somebody has spoke to them, because somebody else did the research that they were thinking about, and so on. And I think that maybe what you've described there is played out in different ways, maybe not as extreme with the billionaire, but it's their experience of pushback from trying to get money or failing to get publications, or because other researchers appeared, which has told them that actually getting to Mars isn't feasible, and therefore I must go down some other route. And so, yeah,
It breaks
it's a
my heart.
complicated world.
Well, it breaks my heart because I hear so many academics talk about, yeah, my funding got denied, so I had to adjust it and then send it up there. And it's like, how many times have you been denied? And it's like, I've been denied. I mean, my field is just, it's not something that, it's going to be the first one to be funded. And it's like, well, that sucks that you feel that way because you're already dismissing your own work. And that, I guess that's from a bunch of denialism, I would say, from, constantly being rejected. Eventually, you're adjusting it so much, it's not the original template anymore. And I get it. There's things you want to fund. Obviously, if you're holding the money, it's only going to be what you think would be more beneficial. But there's a lot of stuff out there that's beneficial to one person that might not be beneficial to another. And how do we choose that? And the way that that's been chosen is depending on who's holding the keys. And that tends to be political parties again. And it's like, damn, we got to cut that bird off.
So thinking about the political parties and the whole system and the effort that governments have put in to make schools more attaining, to get their kids better at maths, to get their kids better at reading or whatever else. And here's the thing that I now conclude, that none of those efforts around the world have had a substantive impact on children's reading or maths. So schools have become better places, but the kids haven't got better at those basics features. And that might seem really surprising to hear, but there's now studies that I mentioned earlier, PISA, Tymms, Pearls, which do the same assessment of kids with samples of countries around the world, and then publish those results every 3 years. And if we look at the results from one survey to the one 3 years before, 3 years before, 3 years before, you get almost identical levels of attainment. So massive efforts by governments, lots of extra money, lots of different ideas coming in, and the level of attainment in maths or reading, or the differences between the rich and the poor, haven't shifted. Schools have become better. Kids have got more qualifications because we've often lowered the barrier to get that qualification. So there are more people going to college, more people with degrees, more people with this and that, and so on. But the basic mathematics, the basic levels have remained constant in the United States, in Britain, in China. There are differences between the countries, difference between classes, massive differences between individual children, but this remained constant.
What do you think about this? Might be the kind of hitting on the subject you're talking about, but what's came to my mind is, what do you think about the idea that we were sales pitched wrong for the times that we're in? And that happens to do with the idea that if you go to college and get a doctorate degree, that you're going to make a sustainable living that way and you're going to be set for life. I feel like the times have changed in that sense only. And I don't think it's like a education problem. I don't think it's a government problem. I think that's a technology issue, that we've just entered this world where you can start an OnlyFans account. You can be an influencer. Now, there's a rare select few that do that, but YouTubers, content creators, this whole avenue where you don't need an education system. And it seems like for the longest time, it was about going to school, I went to college, community college, but, I went there and, I don't use my degree for anything. It was for psychology. So it's like, I don't use any of that type of stuff. I just left it there. It was just something to prove something. And it was like, we're in a different time. And I feel like with the time that we're in now, if you're finding, we're talking about the division between the rich and the poor, man, you have doctors that would be rich 20 years ago that are poor because of an aspect of everything has gone up in pricing. There has been this idea that if you go to school and get an education, you're going to make it in life. You're going to be able to get your own home, a 401k, all these types of things. But I've talked to so many researchers that were like, I'm still in debt. I'm struggling, and it's like I can't be like, let's clear your debt. I can't do that. I don't have that ability. I know a lot of people like that type of stuff too, but I just think with the times that we're in, we're valuing maybe education a little bit differently, which is very, very appreciative. But also, there's a large amount of spending that's being funneled somewhere else. I think it should be prioritized in education. I think you need to teach a lot of kids, but where do we bring our area of concern to? Do we bring our area of concern to, like I was mentioning earlier, about older academics, people that get involved in the business and they slowly start realizing that there's a set system and you have to play ball? Or do we start it young where we educate on other topics, not just mathematics and reading? I think you need to educate kids on social media. You need to educate kids on a whole host of new problems. I know they say textbooks are always out of date. They need to be updated. They're running by old information or not how we think of now. I've heard that get discussed a lot, but I go, but isn't it our curriculums as well too? It's like, should we incentivize teachers to want to update their template that they've been teaching every single students every single year to something more adaptive when it comes to like, hey, virtual reality is a thing. That's a subject you can research and study. Okay, if that's new and updated, shouldn't we try and look at the other classes that are teaching old English? Like, you can use different technologies to understand the information better. You don't just need to read it out of a textbook with 80,000 people's names scribbled into it who died like 1,000 years ago. I'm just saying.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting issue. So, what should we be teaching now that would benefit kids when they're adults? And really, we don't have a crystal ball. And in education and in social science, we're very bad at predicting what's going to happen in the future. There's a great study by Tetlock and someone else where they take famous people in their area and ask them to predict things later in 10 years down. And he did that and then looked at the results that they all predicted. And he said, well, actually, they did no better than a chimpanzee throwing a dart at the board. So we're very bad at saying what we need for the future. But all the studies in the past have suggested that the better that you do at basic skills like maths and reading, the more salary you will earn in the long run. But that's only on average. There'll be some people who've done pretty badly in those who earn a lot, and some people who've done really well who are actually bankrupt. So that, these are average figures. And of course, there are new skills coming up, just as you say, on social media. We need to skill up on that, and maybe we need to be teaching it. But I'm pretty clear that we do need the kids to be adept at mathematics. They need to be literate. And the mathematics doesn't just mean learning rote algorithms, how to do a long division or whatever. It means being able to solve problems. It means being able to use your knowledge in this unknown situation to be able to try to take that forward. And of course, that ability to deal with new problems and to solve them in an intelligent way with other people as part of a team is something that we really would value if we could teach it in a good way. So knowing what to teach, what's on the curriculum, absolutely crucial. How should we teach it? Absolutely crucial. But what should we be doing that predicts later in 20 years? That's a hard question to answer, apart from the basic things.
Well, that's why it makes it such a good topic to talk about, because, I mean, you need to have discussions like this. Everyone's going to have their own opinion based on their own experiences, too. I mean, even if we talk about like someone making money 20 years from now based on their reading and mathematics, I mean, a lot of that's also luck of the draw as well, too, in my opinion. I mean, if you talk about one person gets the same amount of education and both the same amount of courses as another person who makes $1 million. Well, that one person could have just gotten to a job and then skyrocketed to the top out of no, whatever. The owner, the boss, the CEO decided, you're dating my daughter. I'm going to make sure you get a good job. That's a luck of the draw, man. Like that's, you got to take an account for those too. But for something that you can't predict when it comes to luck, for instance, but things that you can control and funnel into. I was always a really good student at reading. I read at a 12th grade reading level when I was young, and I had the ability to get into a lot of trouble. And for my punishments would be reading the dictionary, which expanded my vocabulary out to a very large degree, which has helped me a lot in
You were
conversations. And
punished. You were punished by reading the dictionary.
yeah, my dad did that when I was a kid. You would read ten words off a page each night, but as you read those 10 words, you would transcribe the actual word and the definition onto a piece of paper, and you would write that 3 times. And then eventually it soaks into your brain where you're walking around at the age of 10, like, why is everybody boondoggling? And they're like, what did you just say? It's like messing around and you have to explain yourself and, you turn into this. But I mean, my trouble, for instance, from ADHD, I think a way to fix that, or a way that it helped me in the long run when it comes to, you get in trouble, you have to study more, you have to do all these types of things just because I got to make up for the things I didn't do when I should have done them. Yeah. So it was a fair punishment. But maybe teaching kids, a good course to teach would be educating kids on people around them that might not exactly be the same as them. Now, I'm not talking about race. I'm talking about mentally learning more about autism, learning more about certain types of mental disorders when it comes to ADHD, for instance. If I would have been in a kindergarten class and every kid would have knew what ADHD was and understood that this person has ADHD, it doesn't mean that they're annoying. It just means that they have a lot more energy than we
So
do.
was your ADHD impulsive, hyperactive? What form did it take?
I'm guessing it's the hyperactive thing. I don't really sleep. I have too much energy. I mean, I post an episode a day and it's 1 hour to 2 hours long, and I do 10 recordings in a day sometimes. I mean, I funnel it to that good aspect of things, but I also think it causes depression in a lot of areas. Mostly, you can't stop thinking about things that you need to be doing, working on another task to enhance your own success. And then also sleep. I mean, I've been getting interested in having sleep scientists on because I've been worried about that part of my brain. Like I'm in I'm 24, but if I keep this up, is 30 going to look like 30? Like, I'm not saying that my skin's going to look bad, but is my brain like, there are sometimes like I just blank out. Like I've had a couple episodes where I'll be like staring and I'll look like I'm paying attention, and then I'll completely go to a different subject. It's not that I was thinking about something different. It's that I took like a micro nap. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's things that I think you need to be aware of and pay attention to. And I bet if you look at any person, like one of these ADHD panels that you probably were on, you can look at any of those people that are involved who actually have ADHD. Look at their depression numbers. Do they experience depression more than the average person? Do they experience other things of regret? Do they experience other types of issues when it comes to personality? Not saying like borderline personality disorders. I'm just saying issues with their mental health. They probably have a severe amount of trauma or some type of experience to them that makes them feel like they need to be doing more, or they feel like they're less. It's these types of things that ADHD, like we hear about the energy, everyone goes, oh, that must be exciting. Caffeine doesn't work on me, but that's what people hear. They go, oh, you can drink as much coffee and energy drinks as you want. You always have energy. I wish I had your energy. Yeah, but you don't talk about the bad that comes with that, the pain, the experience of never being able to wind down or never being able to calm down. Or yeah, talking like this is good on a show. It makes me a
So
good speaker.
paradoxically, caffeine is a stimulant, but so is Ritalin. And in fact, it seems odd, but when you take Ritalin, it's more stimulus that actually makes you better off or calms you down. It's a kind of not what you expect, not the way around you expect.
Caffeine doesn't just it.
It
Caffeine's
doesn't
supposed to ramp you up, but it doesn't do anything for you.
doesn't do it. No,
No,
no.
I'm constantly like, I'll have minutes where like I'll have full energy, like talking like this, and then I'll have this moment where for 10 minutes I'm completely just dead tired, like I'm dead to the world. Then my batteries recharge like that. Like I can do 4 hours of cardio like it's nothing, and people go, that's insane. I'm like, well, not to me, because I need to work out twice to actually get some good sleep. Like that's it's good, but I mean, can you keep that up forever? Eventually, you start looking like you're 60 years old and you're dying.
Oh, well, I don't know the physiology there, but I would say just keep going. There's plenty of people. You've got a good battery in there, so keep it running.
What about when you're on these ADHD panels? What do you experience? Like, what's the bad stuff that a lot of these guys experience?
Um, well, just thinking about individual kids with ADHD, some of them have had, really tough time. I mean, they get rejected really by the family. That's the worst thing, where because there's such a hassle in the family, and maybe you'll get the parents going on a parental course to help them work with their own children. So fortunately, I think genetically we would expect the parents to have some ADHD if the kids have it, and so they've kind of natural understanding, or it's natural feeling for them. So those kids have been maybe rejected, not found friends, and often that impulsiveness, that interrupting, that becomes annoying to the other kids, and so they don't have the friends that they would have. So by the time they've got into high school, they're in a bad place. They've not got their friends, and they can go off the rails at that particular time. They need support, and what I've seen in the UK system is that they'll often get support up through their schooling, and when they get to the end of it, about 16, they're left alone. They don't get the kind of medical help that they really need from that time onwards. I also see with ADHD that you get a kind of um, schools think they can deal with it, the medics think they can deal with it, the behavior support people can deal with it, and those different groups don't talk to each other. They're all trying to deal with it separately, and that's very unhelpful for a system way of operating. People should know what's happening there, and some of the good things that have come out are where the parents have spoken to the teachers, or that maybe there are texts going between them so that they know what to expect, or what's happening there.
What what would you be, or what would you see as a fix for, because what you just explained was basically explaining my whole educational thing. Mostly, I think it was a lot of the aspect of like you end up becoming a loner in some sense.
Yeah,
You'll
yeah.
have friends, but it's better if you just don't say a lot, because when you tend to speak, you speak a lot. And I think that's very abrasive for a lot of people. Like for me, for instance, that's exactly how it was. I would say something, and then a conversation would start, and then I would go off and have these giant rants like I've been doing in this episode, for instance. And then people just go, it's hard to be around that every single day. And it's not like you mean anything bad by it. It's just an aspect of people just don't understand that you might think a little bit differently. But I wonder, is it my experience where a teacher should, I have my third grade teacher that figured out it was ADHD and decided to let me go run. And we can't expect individual teachers to take that time on to a student, like we mentioned earlier, but also our parents. I was lucky that my parents didn't put me on an ADHD drug, even though they were recommended by the school and doctors too. Mostly because they were more afraid of, I don't even take Tylenol. It's like my whole thing. I just let my body kind of like, you got to work it out. And that was always my parents' method. Like, he'll grow out of it. He'll do something. He'll figure it out. And I learned to control it a lot better. When I was a kid, I was hell. Like, I'm surprised my parents didn't leave me somewhere. Just because I look back, I'm like, how did you deal with that? How did you cope with that? They're like, just let you run your energy out. And it's like, yeah, but not every parent can do that. Like, that's a very lucky, rare route right there. And you lead into this area of like, so then where do we start fixing the issues of it? Is it better understanding of it with education and teaching it to fellow classmates to, because honestly, it's not my own physical and mental well-being that I get worried about. It's the emotional side of things when I see a kid suffering from ADHD, because an ADHD and an ADHD person talking, it's really like, it's not like, it just sounds normal. It's like we're both like ramping up to these levels and going back and forth. But then, if I'm watching a kid who has ADHD trying to kind of assort himself around a bunch of other people, most of the time they're like being like called annoying or something. And it's kind of heartbreaking, because it really that messes with the kid's head. And we talk about emotional stability later down the route. It's like sometimes it doesn't excel into a good person sometimes.
I'm not going to pretend I have a solution to these.
Why we talk about it.
These are tough problems, and they're difficult to deal with. I did, with a colleague who did her PhD on ADHD, write a little booklet for teachers called Working with Difficult Children. And the idea was that we would give this booklet to the teachers, and then they would understand these kids better. And we're going back a few years, so probably knowledge of ADHD wasn't that great in the UK. We took 2,000 schools and we gave that book to 1,000 schools, but not to another 1,000. And then we waited a while, and then we asked how things were going and how was the kids learning, and did more get rid of it. And we found positive results coming from that booklet, but it didn't transform the world. It made a little bit of difference. And I think that's the kind of situation where we are. And maybe some of those solutions come from the medics who are studying it, maybe from the psychologists, or maybe from people like you who can talk about it. But understanding it better, I mean, there are certainly teachers who would dismiss the idea that they've got ADHD. You know, they just say, "Oh, just badly behaved." You know, there's no such. So you would find that view around there, or the teacher who's finding difficult with the kid and they want them on medication because that'll shut them up and that'll make their day a little bit better when they're there. So there's all this kind of going on, but it's pretty common. I mean, 1 in 30 kids has ADHD or thereabouts. So that means one class of kids, you're likely to have one kid who's got ADHD in there. So it's a pretty common feature. And of course, there are kids who haven't reached a threshold for a diagnosis for ADHD, but nevertheless have ADHD characteristics. So you'll find a great deal more of those around, and they're going to be to a penny. I mean, they're all over the place.
When we talk about a diagnosis of it, though, is it going to be harder and more difficult later down the line with the amount of people's attention spans that are getting shot? Like seems like a lot of kids, like if I walk into a kindergarten class, are they just kids having energy and having fun? Or is it a bunch of kids that have like this, every generation now that seems to be coming up seems to have a different or some type of diminished capacity and expanded capacity in some other direction that was not like the previous generation?
Right. I'm not sure about that. I haven't seen any evidence that there's less attention than there used to be or less concentration. It's very difficult for us to judge it because we see it with our eyes that are getting older year by year. And there's a general feature of the world was wonderful 20 years ago. And you know, that's always been the case. So that's a thing. But of course, little children haven't reached a maturity level that allows them to control them. So we would expect young kids, 2-3-year-olds, kindergarten kids, to have ADHD characteristics. That's normal, and it was ever thus. So I think that's nothing to worry about.
What about the positives? Have you seen any like good turnout cases?
Well, I think there's a lot of positives that you can have, and I think there are interesting arguments about the origins of our evolution of ADHD characteristics. So I think every society needs someone who will stand up and speak out when everybody else is cowering, or the one who will run out of the cave when the lion's there to see if what actually happens. So that they kind of sacrifice themselves for the rest of the group. But I think in historic terms, in evolutionary terms, we've evolved to have a certain proportion of our population having ADHD characteristics. And that was evolving in the savannah of Africa, 500,000 years ago. So maybe some of those characteristics are not appreciated in modern society, where you're expected to sit down and be heard when you're 6-year-olds in a classroom. And that's just the kind of opposite. So maybe we need to recognize that and have ways, as your teacher discovered, of keeping those kids very active, finding them ways to use their energy. But there are advantages to ADHD characteristics.
So like a cultural shift, for instance, like how we've kind of went from being brute strength and these alpha male types being like really tall and strong people. Now it seems like the mental or the more, the brain power, I would say, has become more of the alpha in a sense when it comes to being like more successful when it comes to business, when it comes to these other aspects.
Right. Yeah. Okay. You don't have to be big and strong and hard to be a CEO and be successful. But I wouldn't say that in the past, the brain power wasn't important. I mean, I think if you were living in a hunter-gatherer society, the one who understood better and remembered better where the good plants were, or understood better how to purify the water, that brain was still important. So I think the brain has always been important. And we have evolved as a species to be clever. We might not think that everybody's clever, but everybody speaks, and my gosh, that's a difficult thing to work out. We've all got language, we've all got certain amounts of um, cunning in us. So we as a species are pretty clever, and we evolved to be clever, and it was because we solved the problems, and the people who solved the problems lived more than those that didn't solve the problems. So we produced what we are, and it includes a bit of ADHD, and it includes a bit of this, and it includes a bit of that, and a bit of brute force occasionally got people what they wanted, but we don't always say that that's a good thing to do. We don't always appreciate them, and they can get rejected by the other people or put in prison by the other people. Mm.
When did you see an increase in wanting to understand ADHD? Like, was there a dramatic, like, just
Ah,
like
ah,
a miss, like a data chunk that was like, how do we explain this?
okay. So what I was doing, I was running projects for schools in which we gave them assessments so that they would understand their children better. These were assessments not for accountability processes, but so that the teacher would know which children they needed to help in what ways for their attainment. And there was a teacher who was working with us, and she said to me, this was about 30 years ago, you know, you need to be picking up on ADHD. So I then read about it and thought, oh gosh, yes, we do. And so we included measurements of ADHD by teachers' ratings of the children's in the classroom. And sure enough, we found that particularly attentiveness was related to attainment. So the kids who were rated by their teachers at 4-year-olds as being inattentive, they tended to struggle more as time went on. And we followed them up actually for quite a long time. I mean, we followed them up to age 16. There are many things that we didn't collect. We didn't collect it on mental health that you were mentioning earlier. We didn't collect it on, how many friends they had, or some were growing out of it, some were growing into it. And we did a number of studies down those lines. But it was basically a teacher who'd experienced in her classroom kids with ADHD who said to me, look, we need to collect data on this.
Were they predominantly boys?
Yeah, most of them are boys. I mean, there's clearly a ratio, and if you get to the more extreme features of ADHD, that's even more tends to be boys. I mean, some people have said that this is because the people who give the ratings tend to give the benefit of the doubt to the girls, so that there may be some bias in this. So maybe the girls have more of this than is showing up in the data. But certainly the teachers' ratings certainly suggest that the boys are the ones in our data, and I think in almost all data that the boys are more likely to catch this characteristic.
The reason I asked that was when we talk, when you mentioned that not a lot of people talk about the mental aspects of things, like the mental health aspect when it comes to ADHD. If you look at I guess the majority, I would say, would be boys that would have ADHD. What do men not really do? They don't really go to the doctor, and they don't really go and talk about their emotional problems. That's just recently started happening. So there's your correlation right there as well, too.
Yeah, yes.
Would you
And
do you well, do you think like a better understanding is what's needed? Because I mean, I think it is, but I just get scared. I'm like, I hope we don't mess it up, because I think you can easily say this kid has ADHD and move them along, and then it's kind of like that kid might not have ADHD, they might just be a kid. But also, I would be a rare case if you talked about nobody really kind of giving you guidance when you had ADHD. I just kind of learned how to internalize it more to where I can function in everyday society. And even then, that's still kind of like, which you can't expect every single person to do. It's like expecting every kid to have a hard life and turn into a Mike Tyson. That doesn't happen. I'm not saying I'm a Mike Tyson. I'm just saying it's a rare case that I've been able to figure out. Like, I keep all my energy up here, so my mind just doesn't shut off.
right, okay. I mean, that trick to internalize rather than externalize is the trick to play if you can, if you've got those characteristics. But it's pretty hard, as I'm sure you discovered, because things happen and you do something and, oh gosh, I didn't mean to do that, but it's just happened. So yeah, that's hard. So yeah, more understanding. Of course, we do need more understanding. We need more understanding of the differences that we see between people, and more appreciation of the differences, so that we don't just want to change people, but we just accept them for what they are, because people aren't going to change that much.
What do you think about this area expanding more when we understand, like, have you talked to anybody who studies consciousness or has studies maybe the human brain, like the certain chemical or mixes that happen in our heads?
Right. Okay. I mean, there are plenty of studies to do with the brain and to do with ADHD and other aspects of that. But they've promised us a lot from those brain studies, and we haven't seen the outcomes yet. They've said, "Oh, we can do that." I've seen scans of brains of people with ADHD and not ADHD, and you could clearly see the brain lighting up in some ways compared to the others. But then I discovered that um, these brain scans weren't the brain scans of a single individual. They were the brain scans of many overlaid in one another so that you could really see what was happening. And an individual brain didn't really show it. It was only when you aggregated a whole lot together. So that disappointed me, and it meant that brain scans probably wouldn't help you diagnose ADHD, for example. So I think the brain understanding is maybe going to help us, but it's not helping us yet. I think more like the randomized controlled trials for differences are the ones that we should be taking most notice of. And we should be listening also to the kids with ADHD and asking them, what matters to you and what can we do?
And you don't have ADHD?
No, I don't. I don't. I'm a
Well,
bit. I'm a bit impulsive.
I don't. I wasn't meaning it like that. I mean, it's very. It seems like a topic that only someone who's experiencing it would want to be
Ah,
interested in.
right. Okay. Well, that's an interesting thought. No, and I can think of people who are not autistic who study autism, or people who are not dyslexic who study dyslexia. I don't think they necessarily go. There's an interest down that line. I mean, if you look at the medics who are studying diabetes, they don't all have
Yeah,
diabetes.
but they probably have an interaction with someone in their life who has had that certain thing that they're being
Yeah,
diagnosed
yeah,
with.
yeah.
Like my buddy, he studies autism and his brother's autistic. So
Okay,
you get
okay.
into this point, like I don't think a person who has autism, depending on their severity, could probably be able to study the certain aspects of autism. But I mean, with ADHD, if I have it and I'm trying to understand what more of it is, I would want to study it. You know, if you have a family member who has it,
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just curious to where you came across it.
Well, yes, I know it's, but of course I've been a teacher, so you definitely meet
Okay.
kids like that. So yeah, it's always in your mind. Listen, this has been a great conversation, but I've got to catch a
Yeah, yeah.
train in a little while and got to get my lunch.
Y-
So
Yeah, no
I'm looking.
worries. Yeah, we're just gonna wrap it up right here real quick and then okay. Where can people find you? You giving me enough of your time? Is there any links or anything you want to promote or say off so I can list it in the description?
I'll send you an email and I'll put
Okay.
in a couple of links there. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you, Peter, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.